Let's turn now to Neysun Mahboubi. He's a research scholar at the Center for the Study of Contemporary China at the University of Pennsylvania. Thanks so much for joining us. First, I want to get your takes on the reforming of Hong Kong's electoral system.
Yeah, so I think this is an aspect of the two sessions, the NPC meeting in particular, that is going to get a lot of press in the West and very critical press. It's probably not the aspect of the National People's Congress meeting that's going to get the most attention within China, because there are other things on the agenda that are probably higher priority for the Chinese domestic agenda. But this is the aspect that's going to get the most attention, I think, abroad, and will be fairly critical because it seems to fit into the trend of continuing to chip away at the one country, two systems model that had been the status quo until this point.
What do you think is significant about what's happening now, China's efforts to change the electoral system this year versus what it did, for example, last year?
You know, I think it's hard for me to know what are the considerations within China, but the way that it looks from abroad is that there are so many other things that China has to deal with right now, both in terms of its own domestic challenges and in terms of its relationship with the U.S. In particular, and maybe with other Western countries. So it's a little puzzling from a foreign perspective why this is something that needs to be prioritized right now, given everything else that is before them.
We saw the Chinese government lay out some pretty ambitious economic targets. This is happening mid-pandemic. We saw expected job growth numbers in urban areas really up there, exceeding last year's, on par with perhaps 2019. Do you fear that it might be too ambitious, given what's happening in the global economy and China's connection to it?
Well, certainly, I think China is the only country that, at the end of the day, reported GDP growth of, I think, only 2%, but still positive GDP growth over the course of the past year. Clearly, China has done a better job of mitigating the pandemic, at least in its first year, than some other countries. And they do seem to be quite confident about their ability to start to withdraw some of the stimulus and to start thinking about some of the systemic problems like too much debt, some of the other issues with the structural economy that had been put on hold for this past year. But I think what's interesting about your question is, China's part of a global economy, and just because it may be feeling better about what it can do domestically does not make it separate from the rest of the global economy. So the rest of the global economy continues to struggle with the pandemic that may well affect China's growth prospects as well.
Beijing is going to focus in on 8 core areas to ensure that China becomes a manufacturing superpower by 2025. They've been discussing some of those. Can you elaborate?
I'm not particularly familiar with all of those specifics. I do know that there are a lot of economic reform ideas that Xi Jinping is pushing forward right now, and I think those are balanced against the complications of this ongoing tensions with the United States, working out its relationship with other Western countries, Europe in particular, and the ongoing domestic challenges, population decline, environmental challenges. So all of these are all in the mix, but it does seem that there is at least on the part of the central leadership a desire to push the throttle forward on economic development now that this first year of the pandemic is behind them.
And part of that model is this dual circulation, which is getting a lot of attention.
Right.
That figures in from the domestic perspective, correct?
Yeah, and the idea of dual circulation, it's that to some extent, maybe because defensively being worried about foreign countries, U.S. in particular, Europe, cutting off supply chains vis-a-vis China, making their markets less available, that China should try to, from the Chinese leadership's perspective, develop its own internal production, distribution, consumer demand model. And it seems that there's still discussion, including from the top leadership, that they want to have external circulation going at the same time. And so I think, how exactly that works out, like what is the internal processes, what are the parts that are left for external, I think it's a little bit complicated to figure out. And at the end of the day, mostly it seems to be that the preference probably would still be the external export-led model that's driven Chinese growth for so many years. But if necessary, they are trying to develop a model of internal circulation in case they have to.